Okay, so the next type of market failure we're going to look at is what we call asymmetric information. Well, some of the things we're going to be looking at in this PowerPoint is what is asymmetric information, what are meant by the terms adverse selection and moral hazard, and you'll also see in your notes the term principal and agent problem. You need to be aware of what that is as well, and how asymmetric information can lead to an inefficiency in resource allocation, and then finally what the government tries to do to try and prevent asymmetric information and people being exposed to asymmetric information. So, asymmetric information is when one party to a transaction, and that can be either the buyer or the seller, so it's not always the seller that has more information, knows more about that particular good than the other party in that transaction. And the problem with that is that it can lead to an inefficient allocation of resources. Okay? And you may have experienced on eBay buying a product where the seller has more information than the buyer, and you end up buying a product not of the quality that you expect it would be. Other markets where it may occur, the second-hand car market, so you may get sold a car that's not up to scratch or that has faulty parts. And the jewelry market would be another example where they claim that the jewelry is of a higher quality than what it actually is. So what actually happens with asymmetric information is the uninformed party can often purchase adversely, and that results in them overall under-allocating resources to certain types of production. So in the example of the used car salesman, if the car is sold for $6,000 and it turns out to have a faulty engine, then that may lead to the consumer or the buyer purchasing adversely, and therefore that would not maximize their efficiency or their living standards. Remember that efficiency, don't get confused by that term. It's all about maximizing society's living standards. So if we're buying cars that aren't up to scratch, that's clearly reducing that person's living standards and is less efficient from the market's point of view. Same with jewelry, same if you get sucked in by a dodgy mechanic that overcharges you. Adverse selection can also occur when the buyer knows more than the seller. So, for example, with health insurance or car insurance, this may lead to more sick people taking out health insurance or more risky drivers taking out car insurance. And this can also lead to inefficient allocation of resources as well, and we'll explain how that can occur in the following slides. Adverse selection may also occur in the workplace. If businesses don't take background checks and find out about employees, they may end up hiring people that aren't up to scratch. So, some of the reasons why asymmetric information can reduce efficiency in a market. So when either the buyer or the seller doesn't have perfect information, and therefore this leads to a less optimal allocation of resources. But the first one I want to talk about is the second-hand car market, and this is all in your notes. There's basically two reasons why this market causes inefficiency. The first is that if you buy a dodgy car, then you're worse off, so your living standards gets reduced. But the other problem with this market is that it's actually also bad for people that are trying to sell good second-hand cars or reputable suppliers, because what happens is that they can't actually get the price that they should be able to get for their cars because consumers are skeptical. So a car that may be worth $10,000 may only be able to be sold by $7,000, so the producer may decide not to sell it, or they may not get the benefit that they should from selling that car. So in essence, the price mechanism isn't working as well as it should because of this idea of asymmetric information. Another problem with asymmetric information, and again I suggest that you should be reading through your notes as you go through this, that healthy people end up getting charged more for health insurance than they should be if the health providers knew everything about each individual client. So what ends up happening is that more unhealthy people have a tendency to get health insurance, which means that insurance providers have to increase their premiums or increase the cost of health insurance, and that's a negative for healthy people and leads to their living standards getting reduced. Again, if there's mechanics out there that are overcharging and taking advantage of, naive or people that don't know enough about their cars, that can lead to consumers wasting time trying to find the best provider, and they may also pay above what they should, which all is about inefficiency. Again, I stress that inefficiency is just about living standards not being maximised. So I've given you a collection of other examples, but these are just examples of how adverse selection and asymmetric information can lead to inefficiencies. The second thing you need to be aware of is this concept of moral hazard. And moral hazard, and I would always use the example of the health insurance or car insurance, is when economic agents adjust their behaviour to one that is less efficient from society's point of view. At the end of this clip, I'll show you a slide that is from Friends that is an example of that I will use when you talk about moral hazard. It's all about when Joey from Friends gets health insurance, and therefore he decides that there's a perfect opportunity for him to catch on fire or cross the road without looking, because while he's obviously still going to be cared about his health, he now doesn't have to pay for any expenses, and therefore he may act in a way that's act less risk adversely, which could have negative impacts because someone's going to have to pay for that, and that's less efficient for society's point of view. So it often happens with health insurance. Drivers, once they have insurance, they may stop driving as carefully, which can have negative impacts for society. It may also happen in the workplace. When workplaces hire people, once people are hired, if you hire someone, say, on a year contract, they might decide to slacken off, which can reduce technical efficiency for businesses because they can't be fired. It also happened with the banks. What happened was the government said that they would bail out any banks that couldn't pay back their loans, which led to some of the banks offering loans to people that couldn't pay them back or risky debtors, and therefore it was less efficient from society's point of view because people were defaulting on their loans. So what happens with moral hazard? It leads to a change in incentives and can reduce technical efficiency in the case with workers, or it can also lead to higher prices in the case of health insurance because there's too many risky clients getting health insurance and everyone else has to pay the brunt of that. And they both reduce society's living standards. So just to finish off, I just wanted to go through, there are some private ways that you can reduce asymmetric information. So through your notes, they talk about screening and signalling, as well as private reviews of companies to try and find out more information, so less people are exposed to asymmetric information. But I just want to talk about some of the ways the governments intervene to try and prevent asymmetric information. So the first one is what we call trade practices legislation. So the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, they have rules that prevent misleading and deceptive conduct. So, for example, if you own a jewellery store and try and sell something at a higher price than what it should be sold, you can get up to a $250,000 fine. Even if you didn't deliberately mislead, those rules still apply. Laws relating to warranties, so for certain car manufacturers that they have to give you a warranty when you sell you a car, even for second-hand cars, so that there's less chance that they will give you a lemon car because then they will have to pay for all the damage or problems with that car. The last one I want to talk about was with employment contracts. What can often happen now is in 2006, they removed unfair dismissal laws, which meant that if you hired someone, within the first 6 months, you could get rid of that person if it turned out that they weren't acting optimally, and that's a way of trying to reduce moral hazard associated with employment contracts, along with ideas like screening and signalling applicants to make sure you have the right person. Some of those unfair dismissal laws have been slightly changed in recent times, but we'll talk about that more in macroeconomics. But that idea of removing unfair dismissal laws allows businesses to reduce asymmetric information as well. But I will be focusing on the first one that has a government solution to asymmetric information, laws against misleading and deceptive conduct. So that's asymmetric information, one party to the transaction having more information than the other, and it leads to moral hazard and adverse selection.